General Lee? McLaws, with Stuart by his side, was forcing a way through the columns of infantry. The main thoroughfare just ahead was littered with debris, a rough barricade blocking half of it, a storefront burning. A man came running out of a building directly behind Stuart and began to raise a rifle, aiming at Stuart's back. Incredible, since dozens of Confederate infantry stood only feet away. A flurry of shots dropped the man in his tracks. Stuart, not even bothering to look back, approached Lee, unaware that in another second he would have been dead. Lee's escort, seeing the drama, became more tense, most of the men now cocking their revolvers, looking around warily. Stuart came up, features pale. McLaws by his side had a bandage around his forehead, left side of his face puffy and swollen, with his eye half shut. "There's hell to pay up there," McLaws shouted. "It's madness. You'd think the entire city sold itself to the devil." "What is the situation, gentlemen?" Lee asked sharply. "To be honest, sir, we're not sure," Stuart interjected. "We got in without a fight, as you saw, but about 4 blocks back it started getting ugly. The fort blew a few minutes ago, guess you saw that. The garrison is making a run for the harbor." "I no longer care about that," Lee snapped. "I want this city intact, not a smoking ruin. And I want it done peacefully. What I've seen so far is barbaric." "It's not us, sir," Stuart said defensively. "It's these damn civilians, both sides. You'd think all the hatred these last 2 years is boiling out. They're killing each other without mercy. I want it stopped now, General Stuart, now." He shouted the last word, half standing in his stirrups. "Get your men fanned out along every street and thoroughfare. I want the word passed that everyone is to return to their homes. The city is now under the martial law of the Confederacy, and a 24-hour curfew is in place. I want that done now." "Sir, I don't think many will listen." Lee looked around, exasperated. From a block away, up a side alley, he saw 2 men pointing toward them. One lowered a pistol and fired several shots. At such a range, of course, the rounds missed, but 2 of his guards set off in pursuit. He wanted to shout for them to come back, but they disappeared around a corner. More shots, and no one came back. His army was not trained for this, had no experience at all in how to take a city and then control it. Even as he thought that, one of his attempted assailants stepped back from around the corner, making a rude gesture and a defiant wave. This time he had a carbine and lowered it to take another shot. A volley from some of Pickett's men dropped him. "We are out of our depth here," Lee realized. For the first time in a very long while, he was flustered, not sure how to act, what orders to give. "General Stuart, cavalry to stay together in troops. Do not let your men split up or get lured off. Infantry to move in company strength. I'll establish headquarters." He hesitated. "Where?" "Mount Vernon Square. It's 6 blocks from here. I'll be at the center of the square. General McLaws, you are to advance down to the harbor. I want a courier sent down to Fort McHenry. We will offer a temporary truce. Ask the commander to please cease any thoughts of firing upon the city and to aid us in containing the fires and the rioting. Any Union troops still in organized formations and attempting to maintain order will be granted free passage back to their lines once order is restored." "I doubt he'll go for it, sir," McLaws said. "He's a real firebrand." "Then that is on his head, not ours. If he goes for it or not, any Union troops you see in formation or attempting to control this madness, grant them a truce. Assistance if they need it, then the right to leave." "With arms?" "Yes, with arms," Lee replied, exasperated at such a picky detail. "They'll need them against this madness. I want those fleeing to be aided and assisted with safe passage." "Sir, what about the—" Stuart began, then hesitated. "The colored." "The what?" "The colored, sir. Some of my men just reported that thousands of them are fleeing north. Many of them are slaves, sir, or runaways from Virginia. By right, they should be returned to their masters." "Like the 2 I saw several blocks back?" Lee asked. "Sir?" "I just saw 2 dead Negroes. One of them a boy hanging from a tree, the other a woman with her throat cut. Is that what you mean?" Stewart lowered his head and said nothing. Another explosion rocked the plaza ahead, debris soaring heavenward, tiny fragments raining down around them long seconds later. "I want the colored left alone. Let them flee if they wish." "But the slaves, General Stewart, just how in God's name will you tell the difference?" All were again startled by his rage. "I don't know, sir," Stewart said woodenly. "Then don't bother with it." "Sir," Taylor said softly, "remember the president is just outside the city. If he hears you've willingly allowed slaves to escape, there could be problems." "Then, sir," Lee snapped, "I suggest you go back out of this city, bring the president here, make sure he sees that hanging, and let him pass the order as to what to do. We are a Christian army that has fought with honor, and I still propose that we maintain that honor. I will not tolerate what we just saw back there." Taylor, absolutely crestfallen, lowered his head. Lee took a deep breath. The fear of earlier, the confusion as to what to do in this strange new battlefield, then the outrage, had overtaken him for a moment. He turned away, mastering his passion, and looked back. "I apologize, Walter. You were doing your job." "No apology needed, sir." Lee leaned over and in a gesture of remorse lightly patted him on the arm. "Gentlemen, remember we are gentlemen," he said softly. "I want this city brought under control. As I said, I will establish headquarters at Mount Vernon Square. General McLaws, pass the message to the commander down at Fort McHenry. General Stewart, start moving your men out as ordered. Taylor, locate General Longstreet and ask him to come to my headquarters. Finally, locate Pickett and order him to start spreading his division out and make sure they understand my orders as well." The gathering looked at him for a moment, trying to process all that he said. Again, there was a flash of exasperation. "Move!" The group scattered. With his escort pulled in tight around him, Lee pressed into the city. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, Headquarters, Army of the Susquehanna, August 3, 1863, 10:30 a.m. Grant looked around at the gathering in his oversized command tent. The day was warm, another heat wave setting in, and his officers were grateful to get their jackets off, sitting about the long oak table in shirt sleeves and vests. Major General Edward Ord, who had arrived only yesterday with the last of the men from his 13th Corps, was relaxed, sipping from a tall glass of iced lemonade. Beside him was McPherson, commander of the 15th Corps, the first unit from the west to arrive in Harrisburg. Burnside, who had reassumed command of his old 9th Corps, which had served in part of the Vicksburg campaign, sat quietly to one corner. He had arrived ahead of his two small divisions, which were still crossing Indiana and Ohio. Couch, commander of the 20,000 militia and short-term regiments that had gathered in Harrisburg at the start of the Gettysburg campaign, was fanning himself with an oversized, wide-brimmed hat. Several divisional commanders and the usual staff were gathered as well, while in the far corner sat Eli Parker, Grant's adjutant, taking notes. Beside him sat Elihu Washburn, who had arrived from Washington only within the last hour. "It's time we started laying out our plans," Grant announced. "And I want to know our state of readiness." "My men are ready any time you give the word, sir," McPherson said confidently. "But it is a question of supplies, remounts, support equipment." The other generals nodded in agreement. Grant looked over at Haupt. The general was actually dozing, and Ord, smiling, nudged him awake. "Sorry, sir." Grant smiled indulgently. Haupt was working himself into a state of collapse. He had lost weight, his features pale, the dysentery draining him of all energy. "Are you ready to report, sir?" Grant asked. "Yes, sir." Haupt stood, leaning against the table for support, and pointed to the map of the entire eastern United States, which was spread on the table. "We've moved over 40,000 men east in the last 3 weeks, and I must say that it is a unique accomplishment in the history of warfare. It has, of course, created certain problems, which my staff did anticipate but could do nothing about during the movement of forces, and now it will take some time to straighten out." "What problems?" Burnside asked. "Locomotives and rolling stock. We commandeered over 200 locomotives from different lines and over 2,000 flat cars and boxcars. Repositioning them back into useful service after their express run east is taking time. I could not ship them back while the entire road, involving several different lines, was cleared for eastbound traffic. Therefore, these last 2 weeks have created some depletion of available trains in the west. Once the last of Burnside's men are in, we need to take a breather to reposition that rolling stock back to their owners, who are screaming bloody murder." "Can't they wait?" Ord asked. "We still need to bring more men in, tens of thousands more." "Yes and no, sir. We will continue to bring in troops. I'm preparing for the next big transshipment of 19th Corps from Philadelphia as they arrive by sea from New Orleans. But in order to keep other activities moving, including industrial and even commercial movement, we have to slow the pace slightly." He paused, looking over at Grant, who nodded his approval. "Go ahead, General. I'm in agreement. Our presence here at this moment has at least alleviated any defensive concerns. In that capacity, we are fully ready to fight. It was beyond my hope that General Lee might actually attempt to sally forth from Baltimore and try to strike us here. We knew that wouldn't happen, but our friends over in the State Capitol building are now relieved. We are not yet, however, an offensive army." Ord grinned, chewing meditatively on a wad of tobacco, leaned over and spat on the ground. "Tell that to my boys. They're eager to get at it, sir." The big problem of logistics now is horses. As General Grant said, we are a defensive army at the moment. We can fight in place, but to move? Not yet, I'm sorry to say. "How soon?" Ord pressed. "Sir, we need over 12,000 more horses and at least 6,000 mules for our supply trains, and we don't even have the wagons yet for the mules to be hitched to. Moving men is simple in comparison. Pile a regiment on a train, get patriotic civilians to pass up hampers of food at every stop, have wood and water in place for the locomotive, and you can go clear from Wisconsin to Maine in a week if you wish. Horses are a hell of a lot more difficult. At best, we can maybe load 100 horses to a train, but that's pressing it. A hell of a lot of weight for the steeper grades. They have to be unloaded every day, exercised, fed, watered. We can't go too fast. A bad bump or shift and you have a trainload of horses with broken legs. A trip of 3 days to move 500 men will equal a week or more with 5 trains with incredible amounts of fodder placed along the way. Then once here, sir, 10,000 horses means 400,000 pounds of fodder a day. Granted, we can pasture a lot of them in nearby farms, but they'll eat that out in a couple of weeks." He shook his head wearily. "How many of our own horses from Vicksburg will come up?" Ord asked. "A lot of my men in the cavalry and artillery are upset about losing their old mounts and trace horses, which are trained to their tasks. I'm having near 5,000 moved by steamers up to Wheeling. From there they'll be loaded on trains. That cuts 600 miles off the train run, but it's a lot slower, and the Ohio is still in flood from all the rains, so it's even slower than expected. The first trainload should be coming in next week." "And the others?" Grant asked. "I'm ordering in trainloads of remounts from as far as Maine. It's a little complex since the actual purchasing of horses is not in my department, only the transporting of them. I can have a procurement officer in Vermont tell me that he has 100 mules. The train gets there, and half of the poor beasts are on their last legs. Shipping them here a waste. The system is riddled with corruption, paybacks, purchasing of animals just about ready to drop. It's a nightmare." Grant tossed down the butt of his cigar after using it to puff a new one to life. "When?" "I think by the end of the month, sir." Grant exhaled noisily. "I'd prefer sooner. That gives me only 4 to 6 weeks of campaigning weather before the onset of autumn." "I know that, sir. I'm moving hard on it." "I know you are, Haupt. What else?" "Sir, with the delay, we'll need to start shipping in fodder as well for the horses already here. Not much at first, but it will quickly increase to 10 to 15 trainloads a day. 3 to 4 times that amount if we are stuck into late fall. Purchasing agents are combing upstate New York for fodder, which is our best route for bringing it down to here. We won't be here by late fall, Grant snapped, and then nodded for Herman to continue with his list. We need 1,500 wagons for supplies. Again, that has to go through a different department than mine. I can cram 25 of them onto a train. We have orders in to factories and suppliers across the country. I think we can make good on those in short order. Fortunately, there's a lot of wagon makers right here in Pennsylvania, and we're offering a premium for quick delivery. There's a purchasing agent in Reading buying them up now. He's efficient, and as fast as a trainload of them is assembled, they're shipped here. We also need 300 more springed ambulances, 20 more forge wagons for the artillery batteries, roughly 100 wagons for headquarters baggage, and most important, 200 heavy wagons for the pontoon trains. Why so many? McPherson asked. We never had that many down in Mississippi. I want 2 pontoon bridges across this river when we move, Grant interjected. And I want enough bridging material together to throw 2 more bridges across the Potomac. If the campaign then presses into Virginia, we will need additional bridging for 6 rivers from the Potomac down to Richmond. You plan to go that far this fall? McPherson asked, surprise in his voice. Grant looked up at him and shook his head. I'm not ready to discuss that yet. And let me remind all of you here that what is said in this tent stays here. I misspoke to even mention the bridging requirements. Haupt, who by the simple process of planning the transportation of supplies already had a good sense of what Grant was indeed planning, lowered his gaze for a moment. He knew men like Ord, McPherson, and Burnside were burning with curiosity about the forthcoming campaign, and though he could surmise what was to come, he would never breathe a word or give something away. Haupt knew Grant would reveal his plans in his own good time, and he was not about to risk Grant's wrath by hinting at anything. There was some grumbling, but all 3 of the Corps commanders knew the issue was closed. The Army has orders in for the necessary pontoon boats with shipbuilders on the Hudson and along Lake Erie. Filling the order is relatively easy, but they are big, cumbersome affairs, and only 10 will fit on a train. I should have them down here, though, at least enough for 2 bridges within 3 weeks. Good work, Haupt, Grant said. Anything else? Yes, sir. Railroading equipment. Railroading equipment? Burnside asked, a bit surprised. For what railroad? Haupt looked over at Grant, who nodded his approval. The Cumberland Valley Railroad ran from here clear down to Hagerstown, Haupt said. That's gone now, McPherson replied. I understand the Rebs are tearing up the rails, hauling them south to repair their own lines. If, gentlemen, and I have to emphasize the word if, Haupt continued, our primary axis of advance is down the Cumberland, I propose to repair the line as rapidly as possible. The Rebs cannot destroy the grading. As for every bridge on the line, fortunately the management of that line has records stored here in Harrisburg, so we have the specifications, and I'm ordering replacement bridges to be pre-cut and ready to be loaded for the entire length of the line. I believe that if we advance down the Cumberland Valley, within 2 weeks we can have the entire line up and running again as long as I have the necessary manpower of trained personnel. You'll have them, Grant said sharply. We must have a couple of thousand men in our ranks who've worked the rails before the war. We can temporarily detach them. But that's a lot of manpower, Burnside interjected. Well spent, Haupt replied. 20 trains a day on that line could sustain the Army while it advanced, cutting down drastically on our need for wagons and mules. I'm stockpiling over 100 miles of track, 20,000 ties, material for water tanks and switching. The Cumberland line managed to get 5 of its locomotives back here before the bridge was burned, and we'll get additional rolling stock and locomotives from the Pennsylvania and the Reading. The bridge 12 miles above Marysville is still intact to the west shore, thank God, so we can run supplies directly down to you once the campaign starts. If, and again I'm only saying if, the campaign takes us down to the Potomac, once into Harper's Ferry, your new supply line can run out of the west from the Baltimore and Ohio. I'm stockpiling replacement bridges for that line as well. I only wish I had enough men and material. I think I could throw a connecting line from Hagerstown across down to the B&O in less than a month if I had 5,000 men." "We'll see," Grant said with a smile. This man was the type of soldier he liked, and he was amazed that Haupt's skills were never fully appreciated here in the East. Haupt had only confessed to him the day before that he had been seriously contemplating retiring from the Army, fed up with its bureaucracy and backstabbing. Fortunately, Grant had been able to convince him to stay on to the end of the campaign, promoted him to Major General, and given him complete control of all military operations on all railroads in the country. And Haupt was indeed right. If the campaign did take them to the Potomac and beyond, it would be worth the effort to run a railroad track from Hagerstown, the 20 miles to a hookup with the Baltimore and Ohio. Such an accomplishment would give him a link from Harrisburg to Harper's Ferry, and from there clear down to the Shenandoah Valley, linking as well back to the Midwest. It was the type of project undreamed of 5 years ago, to run a line 20 miles in 1 month solely for the purpose of supporting an army in the field. Today, if need be, it could be done, and if he gave the order, it would be done. "Other supplies?" Grant asked. Haupt stood silent for a moment and seemed to sway. Grant looked over nervously at Elihu Washburn, who sat quietly, unobtrusively in the corner of the tent. Elihu shook his head. "Perhaps later, General Haupt." "No, sir. Just a minute more, and then, yes, I think you'll have to excuse me." Haupt took a deep breath, sweat glistening on his face. "Ammunition. Enough stockpiled now for a strong defensive action, but sustainable for only 2 days at most. Just over 100 rounds per man in the ranks, 2 caissons of assorted solid shot, shell, and canister for the field pieces. The suppliers in New York and Massachusetts are working 24 hours a day, and we should be up to the levels you will need in 4 weeks as well. Artillery. You have 110 pieces with you now, a mix of Napoleons, 3-inch ordnance rifles and Parrots, 2 batteries of 20-pounders and 1 battery of 30-pounders. Again, you should have 100 more guns in a month." "Rations?" Grant asked. "That's going ahead of schedule. It's convenient that we are near Philadelphia and New York. Hardtack is almost up to the level to support us for a month in the field. The same with salted pork, coffee, sugar, tobacco, tea. Farmers from as far away as Berks County to the east are driving in herds of cattle and swine. We'll have a good supply of food on the hoof. Medical supplies as well are more than sufficient." He hesitated for a moment and again seemed to sway. Grant could see that the man was about to have another violent attack. "General Haupt, you are excused, sir. And please, will you get yourself over to my doctor and then take some rest?" "Yes, sir," Haupt gasped, and bent over slightly at the waist, he staggered out of the tent. Grant followed him with his gaze. Over 2 years of war, he had learned to become hard when it came to the using of men. He had looked into the eyes of far too many, knew he was ordering them to their deaths or the destruction of their commands, and then told them to go, never hesitating, never showing sentiment. War had no room for that, no matter what it might do inside his heart. Haupt was valuable, far too valuable to use up, but it was obvious that the dysentery that was tormenting him was beginning to drain his life away. And yet he had to continue to use him rather than order him back to a hospital in the rear. He had tried that once, and the following morning he had found the man in the telegraphy office, dictating orders as fast as 4 scribes could take them down, his mind some sort of strange calculating machine that could not stop whirling. Grant looked back to his 3 corps commanders and the various staff and division commanders gathered around the table. "I want this army ready to move within the month," he announced. There were nods of agreement, though he could see that Ord, if given the order to jump into the Susquehanna today, would do so. "We are constrained, as are all armies, by our supplies. General Haupt is doing his best to see us through." "And additional men?" Burnside asked. "I am still 1 division short of a standard corps. I would have liked to have brought along the 23rd Corps from my old command in Kentucky." "I understand, Burnside. I would have preferred it as well, but we have to maintain some kind of force in Kentucky." You will receive an additional division by the end of the month." "From where, sir?" Grant hesitated for a brief instant. 8 colored regiments, currently being recruited in Ohio, New York, and Pennsylvania, are to report here. They'll be at nearly full strength. That should be 6,000 additional men. Do you object?" He watched Burnside carefully. More than one general would flatly refuse such an offer, even if it meant his command remained under strength. "No problem with that at all, sir," Burnside said, and then he actually smiled. "Freemen or slaves?" "Mostly freemen from the north, though we might have a regiment or two of untrained refugees from Maryland. Why?" "Slaves are used to the toughest work. Army life is a picnic in comparison." "Until the mini-balls start whistling," McPherson interjected. "Still, I think the black man will prove to be a tough soldier. I'll take 'em." "Fine, then, they're yours. You appoint the division and brigade commanders. Make sure they are of like mind and can inspire these men. I suspect the president will be watching this closely. I don't want these men held back, nor do I want them thrown away as a sacrifice. But they will be expected to fight when the time comes." As he spoke, he looked over at Elihu, who nodded in agreement. "What about the 19th Corps?" Ord asked. The men around Ord nodded in agreement and anticipation. 19th Corps was a familiar command to all of them. Though unfortunate to be under General Banks, they had campaigned well farther south on the Mississippi, misused at times by their leader, but good fighting men, nearly all from New England and New York. It was ironic that they, rather than Western troops, had wound up on the lower Mississippi, a fate decided by the ability to ship them from northern ports to support Farragut's naval assault up the river. The men had suffered terribly. For every battle loss, half a dozen were felled by ague or yellow fever. The men were ecstatic to be coming back north again, and would be eager for a fight on familiar terrain rather than the muddy swamps and bayous which had bedeviled them for over a year. Even now the convoy bearing them was coming from New Orleans, supposedly to begin docking at Philadelphia in a matter of days. The original command had close to 30,000 in their ranks. A brigade of infantry, the locally recruited Corps d'Afrique, and some other militia to be left behind to garrison New Orleans. The famed Grierson, commander of their cavalry, a match for Stuart's men, was coming with his brigade as well, to be remounted in Philadelphia once they arrived. Their arrival would increase his army by over 30%, giving him 4 solid corps of combat-experienced troops, all of them used to victory. "The 19th will fall in on Harrisburg within the week. We have to be careful with all these forces coming from the Western Theater. I don't want any slacking off over this next month," Grant said, and now his voice was sharp. "I've seen a bit of it already. Some of the men swaggering around, lording it over the militia and the 90-day regiments." As he spoke, he turned and looked straight at old General Couch, who had come to him repeatedly with the complaint. There were still 20,000 militia with him in Harrisburg, and the old general wanted to take them into the field to convince as many as possible to re-enlist for the duration of the campaign, or the current emergency, as he was calling it. A number of fistfights had already broken out between the Western veterans and the Green recruits from the East. The camp of one Pennsylvania militia regiment had been raided only the night before, the men actually stripped of their uniforms, shoes, rifles, tentage, and choice rations, with the culprits running off into the night, hooting and laughing. The hospital was filled this morning with several dozen cases of broken bones, and one man lingering near death with a fractured skull. "Well," Ord interjected, "the boys have a right to be proud." Grant glared at Ord. Damn, Ord knew it was his boys and was trying to cover up for them. "I want an army that is united," Grant snapped. "It's why I left the name Army of the Tennessee behind when we got off the boat at Cairo. This is a new army. Do you understand that? A new army, the Army of the Susquehanna." No one spoke. Even Ord lowered his head, though Couch did smile. But his grin disappeared when Grant caught his eye. "And by heavens, General Couch, if you can convince your men to sign on for the duration, enough to field another corps, they will march and they will fight like soldiers. I rode past your camp yesterday, and a pig wouldn't live in it. As for your men, if that is how they plan to look and fight, I'll ship every last one of them across to the rebels and have them sign up with Lee. With men like that in his command, it will only help us to win." Now it was Couch's turn to look crestfallen. "You have commanded a corps in the field, General Couch. Given your experience, I expect you to whip your men into shape. Militia, 90-day regiments, I don't care. They are to be turned into soldiers ready to face Hood, Pickett, Scales, and Early. You faced them before, Couch, and I'm asking you now, will your men be able to stand on the volley line a month from now? I know the mettle of the rest of my men, but yours I'm not sure of. And by God, if they break and we lose this war, I will hold you responsible." Couch nervously looked around the room, the other 3 corps commanders all glaring at him. "I will do my best, sir." "You haven't answered my question, General." Couch hesitated, cleared his throat, then finally nodded. "I will have them ready, sir." Grant turned away from him. "Remember, we are one army now. All of us. There will be no room for mistakes either on your part," and he paused for a moment, "or mine." He caught Elihu's eye, the congressman sitting intent, soaking up every detail. "Our republic cannot sustain another Gettysburg or Union Mills. If this army is destroyed, our cause is finished. We are stripping every available soldier from our other fronts for this action. We might very well lose some of the gains made in the past year, perhaps a length of the Mississippi, maybe even New Orleans. But that at this moment is not of consequence to us. I have for us one goal and one goal only, to destroy General Lee's army in the field and to take Richmond." No one muttered an approbation, or worse yet, gave some sort of foolish patriotic reply. All were silent. "Gentlemen, when we cross that river and move, I do not ever want to hear again someone worrying about what Lee is doing. I want Lee to worry about what we are doing. I do not want anyone worrying that an action taken might lose a battle and thus the war. I want everyone focused on one thought, that the actions we take will win the battle and win the war. Do I make myself clear?" Again no response, only a few nods, though a subtle smile did crease the faces of McPherson and Ord, men who had been with him for over a year. "I've said enough. I want full drill every day except Sunday. I expect to see the roads east of here filled with men marching daily, full packs, good march discipline, and the men in shape. They've had their time to relax, and that is finished. I want to see good food and plenty of it, but no waste. The discipline against strong drink is to be kept in force, and that goes for my officers as well." His glare moved from man to man. Some met his eyes, some lowered their heads. "We meet again 3 days from now, same time. Dismissed." The men cleared the tent. Outside he could hear them immediately start to talk. Comments about, "The old man's ready for a fight." Ord's distinctive high-pitched laugh about a good chewing out making a few men nervous. "That certainly had some heat to it." Grant looked up to see Elihu smiling at him. "It was needed." "Tell me everything," Grant said, motioning to the chair by his side. Elihu, who had sat through the meeting in formal attire, gladly took his jacket and tie off, his finely ruffled shirt plastered to his body with sweat. He groaned with delight, took a glass of lemonade, the precious ice long ago melted, and drained it off before sitting down. "Some good, some bad. Go on." "As you ordered, I brought Dan Sickles up here with me," Elihu said. Grant nodded. "His reaction when you told him you were escorting him to meet me?" "He wasn't pleased, tried to beg off, said duties of command, all the usual. I handed him your written order, and that took the wind out of his sails, though he did mutter about having to check with Secretary Stanton. And the letter from the President informing him he was to comply with all your orders settled his hash. He's waiting in a tent just down from here." Grant looked over at his adjutant, Parker, who had remained silent in the corner of the tent throughout the meeting. "Give Mr. Washburn and me about 10 minutes, then go fetch General Sickles for me." Parker grinned. "Yes, sir," and he left the tent.
"How are things in Washington?"
"In an uproar. The siege is wearing nerves thin."
"They're most likely facing no more than one division of infantry and some cavalry."
"Still, Heintzelman is ordering all troops to stand in place within the fortifications. He fears a ruse, and Stanton agrees." Grant nodded his head.
"Fine for the moment, but he should still be probing, making Lee a bit nervous, maybe forcing him to send some troops back that way."
"I carried that suggestion to the president. He said it's like watching a blind woman trying to catch a goose and cut its head off." Grant chuckled softly. "But Heintzelman did put up a good fight defending the city."
"Yes, he's good for a defensive fight,"
Grant said softly. "Any thoughts on that?"
"Not yet. Perhaps later. But what else?"
"You heard about President Davis and the state convention in Baltimore."
"Just that they were meeting yesterday."
"The rebels have convened a new state legislature. It was sworn in late last night. Its first act was to officially declare that Maryland has withdrawn from the Union and joined the Confederate States of America. Admiral Franklin Buchanan was appointed provisional governor until an election can be held. Judge Richard Carmichael is provisional lieutenant governor and acting as governor until Buchanan can come up from Mobile."
"Interesting turn of events,"
Grant said noncommittally. "A smart move by Davis. Carmichael is held in high regard, even by some pro-Unionists. I don't know if you are aware of this, but he was the presiding judge of the Seventh Circuit Court. Some damn coward and two of his cronies pistol-whipped the man nearly to death because of his pro-Southern leanings. It was an outrage felt across the entire state. He's acting as governor for the moment until Buchanan, who is a Maryland native and the highest-ranking officer in the Confederate Navy, comes up to take the post."
"The fact he commanded the ironclad Virginia will play well with some. Besides, I've heard he's an able administrator."
"Exactly. You have a war hero with naval tradition that appeals to Baltimore. In fact, the man was born there and is a well-respected judge who can work the political angles. A smart move by Davis."
"What about Fort McHenry?"
"Still holding out. That's a strange truce neither side wants to break at the moment. If Lee tries to seize it by a frontal attack, he'll lose thousands. The garrison is well reinforced now. On the other side, President Lincoln has ordered the garrison commander not to fire unless fired upon. If we set off another conflagration in Baltimore, it only will serve the other side."
"The heavy artillery captured around Baltimore?"
"Hard to get accurate reports on that. Some say the guns positioned up on Federal Hill are now all Quaker guns, just painted logs. But with so many civilians around, that would be hard to conceal. There are some reports that Lee will dispatch the heavy siege equipment toward Washington. Others say he'll finally be forced to try and reduce McHenry. Frankly, I hope he fires on McHenry."
"Why?"
"The symbolism of it, General Grant. The sight of our gallant star-spangled banner remaining defiant against the British. Every artist and editorial writer in the North will have a field day with that one." Grant had never really thought of it in that light. As for the song, he found it far too difficult to follow, the latter stanzas rather overblown.
"So far the news you bring is bearable. What's the bad news?"
Elihu smiled and shook his head. "Lee is reportedly starting to get reinforcements. The first of Beauregard's men are reported to be in Baltimore. There are accounts he'll get upward of 30,000 fresh troops."
"We'll see,"
Grant replied without any emotion. "We know as well that he is absolutely burdened with artillery. His standing force, the guns taken at Union Mills that weren't spiked, additional field pieces at Baltimore. Word is he has 250 guns and the ammunition to keep them firing for days. They're converting some of their infantry over to artillerymen." Grant said nothing. In an open-field fight, the type of terrain to be found in a fair part of Maryland, expansive fields and pastures, combined with good roads to move the guns rapidly, this could be a problem. "Sickles," Elihu continued. "He's cut up a fuss with Stanton that the 19th Corps should be incorporated into his command, and Stanton agrees."
"Damn him. Stanton has to quit interfering." Grant muttered softly. "The President said it's up to you, though, since you have direct command in the field." "Thank God for that." "Sickles is also diverting trainloads of equipment and supplies, at least that's the rumor. His Tammany friends have raised 5 regiments. They paid a lot for them, too. The governor of New York, when he had them sworn in, specifically stated they were taking duty with the Army of the Potomac. We've got to put a stop to that." "Be careful, Sam. Even Lincoln conceded that for the moment Dan Sickles cannot be touched. So I have to ask that you tread lightly." I know. "That's it in rough form. The President is keeping his nerve up to the hilt. At least 50 papers up north have already declared, or will after today's announcement of Maryland's secession, that the President should negotiate a ceasefire with Davis." "His response?" "In confidence?" "Of course." "He said he wished it was winter. That way he could use the papers as kindling to warm his feet." Grant could not help but laugh at the image it conjured. Elihu grinned. He made another reference to how he might use them as well, but good taste forbids me from citing him. "More in line with what I was thinking." "I won't quote you either, General." Both men smiled, the interlude interrupted by the clearing of a throat outside the open flap of the tent. It was Parker, General Sickles by his side. Grant took a deep breath and stood up. "General Sickles, please come in and join us." His tone was neutral, not genial nor cold in the manner in which he had just addressed some of his closest companions only minutes before. Sickles stopped at the entryway and formally saluted, Grant returning the salute, then motioning for the commander of the Army of the Potomac to come in. Elihu went through the motions of being a proper host, pouring a glass of lemonade and offering it to Sickles, who politely refused. "If you don't mind, sir, after such a hot and arduous trip up here, I'd prefer something a little stronger." "We don't serve liquor at this headquarters, General." "Oh, really? Too bad. If you should need some, sir, do let me know. I keep an excellent selection at my headquarters. It is good for morale at times." Sickles reached into his hip pocket, pulled out a flask, picked up an empty lemonade glass, poured several ounces of brandy, and took a drink. Grant said nothing, eyes cold. Sickles drained half the glass and put it back down, his features going slightly red, and he smiled. "It is good to see you, General Grant." "I'd like a report, General Sickles, on the status of the Army of the Potomac." "It is moving along, sir, but slowly, I regret to tell you. As I indicated to you in my report filed last week, the Army has been reorganized into 3 corps. The old 3rd, the 5th, and the 6th. I have a little more than 30,000 men now under arms, nearly all of them veterans of the best sort. I have 80 guns, 4,000 men mounted." He fell silent. "That's it?" "Yes, sir. There is not much else to say. The men are still recovering from the, how shall I say it, mishandling they suffered from last month. But morale is improving, the men training for the next campaign. May I ask when that will begin?" "When we are ready, General Sickles, and not before." Sickles nodded thoughtfully, on the surface taking no offense from the obvious rejection regarding a discussion of operational plans. "You heard about the traitors in Maryland switching sides?" And Sickles looked over at Elihu. "Yes, the congressman just told me." "Some sort of demonstration, perhaps, on your part," Sickles offered, "might be of advantage now to show them we will not take this lightly." "As I said, General Sickles, when we are ready, and not before." Sickles nodded and drained the rest of the glass. He started to open his flask again, but the look in Grant's eye made him stop. "Is there something you wish to tell me, General Grant? I've traveled a long way to meet with you, time that frankly I had hoped to spend with my command." "My command," Grant said softly. Sickles froze, eyes unblinking. "Sir?" "The Army of the Potomac is my command as well, and will obey my orders to the letter." Sickles forced a smile. "Sir, but of course. However, you being new to the East, sir, I dare say that there are unique aspects to the Army of the Potomac that will take time to fully understand. It is but one component of the armies of our republic. It will be run like any other army, will fight like I expect every army to fight, will answer my commands, and will see this war through to its proper conclusion."
Sickles said nothing, the smile frozen on his face.
"You, sir, have direct field command. That was the decision of the Secretary of War and President Lincoln. I hope, sir, that you fully understand that responsibility and live up to the obligation of your command and the obligation to lead your men properly."
Sickles's features darkened. "Sir, I fought with those men through the peninsula and every campaign since right to Union Mills," his words coming out forced through clenched teeth. "I think, sir, I do not need to be lectured on my obligation to my men." Grant sat back in his chair, the silence in the tent chilling. "I don't think General Grant meant any offense to you personally," Elihu interrupted. "I should hope not. I know my men and they know me. If I had been listened to at Chancellorsville, at Gettysburg on the second day, at Union Mills, we would not be in the fix we now find ourselves in." "I will not dispute your suggested decisions in those battles, General Sickles," Grant replied. "I'm just stating that in the future you will coordinate your actions with my direct orders. If we understand that, sir, I know we will work together well." "Fine then, sir," Sickles responded, voice still strained. "I understand what you are saying. Is there anything else you wish to discuss?"
"Regarding the 19th Corps."
"Sir?" Now his features shifted in an instant to open-faced innocence. "Is there a problem with their shipment to Philadelphia?"
"No. It is just that they will be detailed to this army here in Harrisburg."
"Sir, is that prudent? I am outnumbered and Lee's army is little more than 30 miles away, while you are here 100 miles from the front."
"You have the mile-wide Susquehanna between you and him, that river patrolled by gunboats. I doubt seriously if General Lee will make any demonstration against you, and the men you have, who, as you said, are all veterans, would certainly be more than a match if he tried to force a crossing. I am confident you can hold with the numbers you have."
Sickles's features were again frozen, as if he was calculating his chances of winning the argument. "I understand, General," he said quietly.
"Fine, then. I hope you may join my staff and me for dinner tonight."
"Yes. Thank you, sir." Sickles stood up to leave.
"And General Sickles, one more thing,"
Grant said casually, as if he was about to address a minor issue. "Yes?"
"A week and a half ago, I passed through Perryville after my visit to Washington. I went looking for you in order to have this meeting. Your staff claimed you could not be found."
"Sir, I was surprised to hear that you were in the area. I was out inspecting units in the field. I hurried back, but you'd already left."
"Next time, sir. When I visit the Army of the Potomac, I expect to see its commander as well."
"I apologize for the failure of my staff, sir."
"Fine, then. That's all."
Sickles stiffened, features red, saluted, which salute Grant returned while remaining seated, and left. Elihu exhaled noisily. "I hate to say it, Grant, but even I could use a drink after that." Grant looked over at him coldly, and Elihu smiled in apology. "Well, you certainly blistered the paint off of him."
"Had to be done. Let's hope he toes the line now. In private, I'll admit he has the makings of a good general in him, a good tactical sense. I studied the reports on Chancellorsville, and the man was indeed right. If he had pushed forward as he wanted, he'd have taken Jackson apart on that flanking march. He has the stomach for a fight."
His cigar had gone out, and he tossed it aside, fished in his pocket for another, and striking a match, he puffed it to life.
"It's going to be a hot day," he said quietly.
Near Gunpowder Falls, Maryland, 15 miles north of Baltimore, August 11, 1863, 6 p.m. General Lee rode with Longstreet by his side, staff including Jed Hotchkiss and a heavy security patrol of an entire regiment of cavalry spread out before them. The evening was turning cool after a warm day of riding. They had set out shortly after dawn, riding with President Davis for several miles until he had continued on to the west, this time escorted by a regiment of Stuart's best and a section of light guns. Once the president was out of sight, he had told Longstreet that they would spend today riding north to explore the land a bit. They had advanced up the road toward Bel Air, nearly halfway to the Susquehanna, then swung about, heading down toward the Chesapeake, following an open river valley with the ironic name of Gunpowder. Reining in to rest Traveler, Lee dismounted, loosely holding his old friend's reins, Traveler cropping noisily at the tall, rich grass. Longstreet dismounted, stretched, and lit a cigar. "Beautiful evening," Lee said softly.
"That it is, sir."
"We do love these moments. If other parts of our task could forever be put aside, if we could have but this, riding reconnaissance, watching our army on the march, now there would be something to enjoy." Longstreet nodded.
"But there is something about the sting of battle," Longstreet replied. "Just before you go in, that is stirring as well, when we are driving them and the men are shouting to go forward."
Yes, and though he felt uncomfortable admitting it, that was true for him as well. The vast battle lines deploying out, the thunder of artillery, flags held aloft, the long, long battle lines charging forward, that piercing yell reaching to the heavens. Those were good as well, except for the price that came afterward.
"I'm not given to religious philosophy as you are, sir," Longstreet said. "But I remember the Norse mythology. Perhaps our heaven, our Valhalla, will be just that, a warrior's heaven where we will march and fight forever, and at dusk the dead will rise to feast together, friend and foe, throughout the night until the coming of the next day's battle."
It was a thought Lee did not wish to pursue. He had dwelled too much on philosophy, on moral questions these last few weeks. To debate now the nature of heaven would reawaken those other thoughts as well, and he needed to again focus on the now.
"You realize the president expects us to end this within another month," Lee replied, changing the subject. "I think we can do it," Longstreet replied forcefully.
Longstreet had stood to one side while Davis had given his final admonition that with the reinforcements that had just arrived, he expected Washington to be taken. "We can win," Lee said quietly, shading his eyes to look off to the west. He said, letting go of Traveler's reins, "But not with another attempt on Washington, as the president expects." Longstreet grinned. "Glad to hear you say that, sir. Dare I assume that is the purpose of our ride today?" Lee smiled and nodded. Davis, unknowingly, had at least given him some wiggle room with his closing statement that he expected the Army of Northern Virginia to force Lincoln into capitulation. He cited a pledge printed in all the Northern newspapers where Lincoln declared that the city is invulnerable and that he would stay there no matter what happened. "He cannot run now," Davis said. "Storm the city, capture the scoundrel, and I will be back to deal with him." He did not exactly say that the city was to be stormed within the next 2 or 3 days, though one would have to admit that the president fully expected that outcome.
"I can see the way you've been looking at ground today," Longstreet pressed. "It's like the old days when we had a chance to look things over before picking our spot."
Lee smiled, his attention diverted by the approach of Taylor and the Army cartographer, Jed Hotchkiss. "Beautiful ground, sir," Jed Hotchkiss announced, a flat board balanced on the pommel of his saddle with a sketchbook pegged to the board. Throughout the day he had been feverishly sketching away, turning out one map after another. "May I see your work, sir?" Lee asked. Grinning, Hotchkiss handed the sketchboard down. "Just rough draft, sir," he said, offering the classic excuse of all artists and writers. "Once back to headquarters, I can run off better copies." Lee took the board, turning slightly to orient himself toward north, Longstreet coming up by his side. "We have 2 good roads coming north out of Baltimore," Lee said, thumbing back to one of the earlier sketches, putting on his reading glasses so he could figure out the finely written details of distances, prominent buildings, and types of terrain. "The first road toward Bel Air," Lee said, pointing to the map. The second, the one we are on now, down closer to the bay and parallel to the railroad, which could be used as well for infantry if the weather turns bad. He could sense the mounting excitement of the other three. The weeks of idleness at Baltimore, though a wonderful chance to relax, reorganize, and refit, seemed out of place for a field army during the height of the campaign season. Battle of their own choosing was again in the air. He reached the last map, the one that sketched this line along the Gunpowder River for nearly 10 miles of length. "I think it will be here," he finally said. "Good ground," Longstreet replied. "We can ring our guns along this side of the stream, force them to cross. This is very good ground." Lee shook his head. "No, I think we'll give it to them." "Sir?" "We're like Napoleon at this moment, but it's not 2 armies we must force apart, it is 3. "We do have the advantage of being in the middle," Longstreet offered. "Washington garrison to the south, Sickles to the northeast, Grant to the north. And if they should all squeeze at once, we have a problem. No, we must lure one of the 3 out, defeat it without question, then turn on the second force and defeat that in turn. Once 2 of the 3 are destroyed, the third will be broken morally, and then we finish it up. I think we can do that, but it will require audacity." "We never lack that," Longstreet said with a grin. "If we offer battle to Sickles, but then dig in here on the south side of this stream, I think even he will hold. He talks big, but he also has the memory of Union Mills fresh on his mind. He will stop, probe, try to flank us, and in the interim I would suspect Grant will either order him to retire or come down upon our flank and rear, and we will be forced to withdraw." He smiled, pointing at the ground around them. "No, I want Sickles alone. I want him overly confident. I want him advancing rapidly. If I give him this ground, after a fight, mind you, but not a real fight, just a demonstration, I think he will come on with a vengeance, thinking we are on the run, and then we jump him. Conceding this ground at the start will embolden him to push on toward Baltimore, and then we spring our trap several miles to the rear." Longstreet grinned. "Fine, sir. Now how do we get him here?" "We set him off half-cocked. Tomorrow afternoon the Army will leave Baltimore and advance on Washington with all proper fanfare. I want it done publicly. Let the rumors fly. We don't press the men, however. We save their strength. How we arrange the marching order will be crucial. I want Hood on the left, Beauregard on the right, and you acting as a reserve in the rear, but instantly ready to turn around. Leave your strongest division here in Baltimore as a garrison. That would be Pickett, and as usual he'll chafe. Let him. No one is to know of this plan other than the 4 of us here. We can tell the others when the time comes." "Thank you for the confidence, sir," Longstreet replied. "Pete, I have to tell someone in case anything happens to me." "Yes, sir." "We engage in front of Washington, make all appearances of preparing to attack. Now, if by some rare chance the opportunity does arise to take the city, we will venture it, but I don't see that happening, at least not without a bloody cost. Our threat, however, will trigger yet another panic in that city and in the North." "But Grant did not even budge last time," Longstreet said, "and we've seen the reports about his statements, along with our observations near Harrisburg of his army building there rather than shipping it all to Washington." "Sickles is the one," Lee said emphatically. "He is the one I'm playing this game to. We know the divisions between Grant and Sickles. It's the same as it was with Pope and McClellan at Second Manassas. We threaten Washington, and I am all but certain that Sickles will find an excuse to bring his army ill-prepared across the Susquehanna. At the very least, he'll see the chance to grab back Baltimore. But I suspect that ultimately he will seek to strike us in the rear. At least he will think he is striking us in the rear." Lee smiled, turning to walk back over to Traveler's side, gently rubbing his old friend's forehead. "We play this for Dan Sickles," Lee said, still smiling. "Bring him down here and let him think he is winning. then close in like a vice, taking him on the flank when the time comes. It will call for careful coordination, Pete. Stewart will observe, skirmish, and offer some delay, acting as if he was trying to buy time, thus causing Sickles to press harder. We then send Pickett up to delay, but not too much. A different kind of fight for him, but it's time he proved himself at it. Then, when the moment is right and all our forces have marched back up from Washington, we hit Sickles with a concentrated attack and finish him. Along the Susquehanna, August 15, 1863, 7:30 p.m. The coup had gone flawlessly. A dozen of his troopers, posing as farmers driving cattle, accompanied by several patriotic young women of Baltimore dressed in homespun and acting like frightened young wives, had come to the southwest bank of the river in mid-afternoon. They had signaled the ferryman on the opposite shore, who had at first refused to cross over. One of the men had then swum the river and, gaining the northern bank, had offered the man $5 in gold to help save their cattle from the damn rebels. The man had complied, and once on the southern bank, was confronted by a dozen grinning troopers with revolvers. The first dozen went across, seized a second ferry boat, and by dusk an entire regiment was across the river, fanning out, setting up a cordon. A third ferry had been seized as well, which even now was bringing over a battery of horse artillery. Wade Hampton, standing on the north bank of the Susquehanna River, was filled with pride. His boys had pulled it off without a shot being fired. Even now the town of Lancaster, but a dozen miles away, was unaware of what would come sweeping down upon them by dawn, a full brigade of Confederate cavalry hell-bent on raiding, disrupting, and sowing panic. The campaign was on again, and after the bucolic 3 weeks in Baltimore, he was eager for the fight. His orders from General Lee personally had been clear and concise. They were no longer in need of supplies. Maryland had yielded up her bounty to them, and the lean, hungry Army of Northern Virginia was a thing of the past. His job, first and foremost, was intelligence, to ascertain what exactly Grant was up to in the Harrisburg area. Was it merely a marshalling area, or was it to be a platform for him to try and sweep down the Cumberland Valley and perhaps march on into Virginia? Next task for him would be their old adversary, the Army of the Potomac. It was time to rattle them yet again, a task he looked forward to with pleasure. Finding the location of the powerful 19th Corps was high on the priority list as well. If they were with Grant, that would indicate much as to the possible Union actions. If not, it would mean they could support a renewed thrust by the Army of the Potomac. Though there was the chance now, with Lee marching toward Washington, that the Yankees, always in panic over their capital, would ship that corps down there by water to reinforce the defenses of Washington. Finally, Lee had emphasized his role of disruption, to cut telegraph lines, to spread rumors, and to work to isolate Sickles from Grant. It was a grand day to be in the cavalry, and Wade soaked up the moment with joy. The campaign had begun. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, August 17, 1863, 9 p.m.
Haupt, good to see you.
General Grant came out of his chair, extending a hand as the frail figure of General Herman Haupt stood by the open flap of his tent. The appearance of the man shocked him. He was wasting away by the day. By the light of the coal-oil lamp, he had a pale yellowish cast to his skin. His cheeks were hollow, eyes sunken. As Haupt took a seat across from Grant, the general made a decision, uncharacteristically, without reflection or contemplation of the impact it might have on his plans.
Haupt, I think I should relieve you of your office. Send you home for a month or two.
Haupt looked up at him angrily and shook his head. I respectfully decline, sir.
Damn it, man, you're dying.
Haupt smiled. Not yet. And besides, you need me.
Yes, I need you, but a lot of good you will do me or the Army if you're dead.
Not by a long shot, sir. Just give me a few more weeks, let me sort out a few things, and then I'll take the leave you suggest. It's getting better, sir. He could see the lie in that, but decided that for the moment he could not push the issue further.
What do you have for me? Grant asked. I barely got through. It's chaos not 50 miles from here. Hampton's taken Lancaster, and is even now riding toward Reading. I'll confess he's made a mess of things for us. He caught a number of supply trains in the rail yard at Lancaster. Wrecked 9 locomotives. We'll take care of him. But what else? I've got 10 more batteries of guns coming down from Albany. I'm routing them around Lancaster and Reading, and they should be here late tomorrow. Remounts are still coming in via the Pennsylvania Railroad. Haupt paused for a moment, reached into his haversack and pulled out a notebook, thumbing through pages. Let's see now. 2,350 horses from Ohio, 870 mules from Ohio and Indiana as well. 75 more wagons out of Lancaster before Hampton hit it. 2 regiments from Illinois and 1 from Indiana should arrive here in 3 days. The colored regiments from Philadelphia will transfer here starting tomorrow. I'm routing them up to New York and then across to Pennsylvania and Susquehanna through Pottsville, yet again to avoid Reading. Replacement bridging is in place at Wheeling for the Baltimore and Ohio, and 1 million rations should be stockpiled there by the end of the month. Vouchers to all the rail lines involved have been drawn as well. He thumbed through his notes. Shoes. I've got 50,000 more coming down from Massachusetts and Vermont, but that will take another week. We're still short of tentage. One of the trains Hampton took was loaded with them, and of replacement rails and some bridging material. The pontoon bridges? Haupt shook his head. Only enough for 5,000 feet so far. I'm pushing it hard, sir, but the routing of trains is still something of a tangle from the Midwest. We've yet to successfully shift all the rolling stock back out there, and it's causing problems. Grant extended his hand and patted Haupt on the arm. You're doing fine. Just fine, Haupt. Herman said nothing, eyes glazed as he stared off. I'd like you to get some rest, Haupt. If I lose you, I lose the one man I'm relying on most right now. Haupt's shoulders seemed to sag, as if the words of comfort had placed upon him an additional burden. Sorry, sir. Sorry I took sick at this time. No apologies should be offered, Haupt. I'll be on the pontoon bridges first thing in the morning. Grant sighed. There was no way he could simply detach this man, to send him home, to let him take a month to recover from his bout with dysentery. Even if he wanted to, he could not. Not tonight. Go and get some rest, General. And that is an order. Yes, sir. Haupt, legs visibly trembling, stood up and saluted. Grant guided him out of the tent and watched him walk off. As Haupt disappeared, he caught Parker's eye. Call for my surgeon again, Grant said. I want that man taken care of. Parker saluted and followed Haupt. Grant stood by the open flap of his tent. The night was cool, pleasant, a gentle breeze wafting in as he lit another cigar, coughed as he drew the first deep breath, inhaling the soothing smoke. In the open fields beyond, hundreds of campfires illuminated the night. He could hear distant laughter, songs, a banjo playing. Nearby, several officers were passing a flask, laughing. It was all so soothing, and in this moment alone he realized yet again that in spite of the horror, the tragedy of it all, he did love it. The scent of wood smoke on the breeze mingled with the rich smell of hay, horses, a gentle August evening camped in the fields of Pennsylvania. Better, far better than Mississippi with its hot, sultry evenings without a breath of fresh air. This was good, a moment of pleasure regardless of all that had transpired in the last day. The latest dispatch from Washington had come in just before sunset. Enemy fire all along a 5-mile front, heavy artillery bombardment, fear that a night assault might be launched. A copy of the New York Herald was on the table, declaring that Washington was on the brink of collapsing. A paper from Philadelphia decrying the continued slaughter, calling for Lincoln to meet with Davis to end the war. Lee might very well attack Washington within the next day or two. He doubted that the man would take the risk. If the situation was reversed, he knew he would attack, regardless of loss, but the South could no longer afford that. But even if Washington did indeed fall, he would stay his own course, and within a fortnight he would be ready to proceed. The waiting was painful, but it had to be endured till all the pieces were in place. Only when all was ready would he move. He would not make the mistake he had made last autumn in front of Vicksburg. Lee was too savvy an opponent to give him that opening. When the time came, Lee would have to be so soundly defeated in the field in an open fight that the hopes of the South would be forever dashed. It was not just a battle on the field of action. It was a battle that would have to shatter once and for all their will to fight. Otherwise, this conflict could drag on for years, fought in the mountains and bayous, a bitter fight that would forever pollute any hope of reconciliation. He had to win not just the battle, but the peace as well. Perryville, Maryland, Headquarters, Army of the Potomac, August 17, 1863, 11 p.m. General Dan Sickles sat alone, contemplating the goblet of brandy in his hand, swirling it, letting the thick drink coat the sides of the glass, inhaling the fragrance, then taking a sip. The moment had come. It had arrived faster than he had anticipated. Another week, 2 weeks would have been preferable. He could still use another 10,000 in the ranks, some more guns. The Army of the Potomac was barely 50,000 strong, 2/3 of them the old rank-and-file veterans, the remainder new troops, many of them 90-day men. His recruiting effort had paid off handsomely, with returning veterans bringing 4,000 new men into the ranks of seasoned regiments. All day long, courier boats had scurried in from Washington. He had tried to intercept the dispatches destined for Grant, but they had been carried by men from Grant's headquarters who couldn't be swayed to reveal the contents. But the news was clear enough, and he didn't need to read the dispatches and secrets of Grant. He had so conveniently set up a telegraph station and announced it was open to whomever needed it on vital business of the public interest that reporters from the New York papers and the Associated Press were hurrying back to use it. All were convinced, though, that Lee was preparing an all-out assault, one that would strike perhaps within the day. Next, there was the news of Wade Hampton. That had been confirmed when, in a delightful display of arrogance, Hampton personally sent a dispatch to the Philadelphia Inquirer, via telegraph from Lancaster, inviting them to come and give an interview, or if the paper desired, he would visit their offices within the week. Hampton had actually created a wonderful situation for the Army of the Potomac. Dispatches and orders between Harrisburg and Washington now had to be routed through New York, and it was causing delays, confusion. It was wonderful, and Sickles was determined to take advantage of it. "General Sickles, the dispatch from the War Department is here." Sickles looked up. The sentry had opened the tent flap. A young captain, one of his own staff, entered and saluted, handing a sealed dispatch from Stanton. It was a private arrangement the two had agreed to the week before, and all day he had been anxiously awaiting what he hoped would be orders. Sickles motioned for the man to wait and opened the envelope, recognizing Stanton's bold handwriting. He scanned the letter, then reread it again carefully, smiling.